one of the great strengths of Silverfleet has been that we've forever focused on making capital gains for our clients and getting to carry. If I'm really honest, the whole fund management logic of invest fast, get out there again, raise another fund, that took a long time for us to kind of realize that is part of the game.
Do you think there's anything from a upbringing or a personality type perspective which meant that for you had that boldness to go and make those big calls quite early?
And then I saw an advert in the newspaper, back to the age thing, for a French or German speaker for what is now Silverfleet. And I rang them up and said, well, I don't really speak French or German. I have O-level in both. But I did spend about 30 days in a face-to-face negotiation with you, selling you Tetley tea. Any chance of a job?
So what you're saying really is that you should have done Life of a Dealmaker quicker.
I think I will go down in history as pulling the plug on Silverfleet.
Welcome to Life of a Dealmaker, the Mayor Brown private equity podcast in which we talk to senior members of the private equity community about their career highlights, lowlights, investment thesis, and everything in between. We hope you enjoy it. Gareth, welcome to Life of a Dealmaker. This is the first episode being filmed outside of the financial district of London. We're here in Strand on the Green, our local area. Do you get down here onto the river much?
Absolutely. Have the obligatory cockapoo that I have to walk around the streets of Chiswick. Yeah.
And you've been a Chiswick resident for a long while.
Yeah, 20 plus years, yeah.
It's also, I think there's a beautiful irony in the fact, which I do have to comment on, which is the fact that you've retained this beard.
Ah, yes.
So here's a story which you won't remember, but I did. We worked together in 2017 on the Silverfleet acquisition of Riviera Travel. It was the classic tough push to signing. I was a senior associate at the time. I remember I came into the office one day through the night in the trench. We signed late, I think mid-late afternoon the day after, and we all went out for drinks afterwards. And the first thing you said to me when you saw me was, so you didn't get time to shave then?
Yeah, the abuse of facial hair that I've given through the years. And now it's the end of an era. When I start growing this, tomorrow when this goes live or whenever, all the barristers in Hoxton will shave their beards off, saying that's the end. You can't be seen with a beard like Whiley's.
So is it fair to say your approach to aesthetic standards in the city have changed over the years? Or
Oh yeah, I was probably the last man to stop wearing a tie, certainly in our office, and then I still don't wear casual clothes that often into the office, but it's because I've still got suits I want to get money's worth from.
Yeah, that's a very private equity way to think about it.
Got to wring the last drop of juice out.
So going back to the start, you grew up in a village in rural Wales.
In Wales, yes.
Is it fair to say that the circumstances and the background in which your upbringing came about was maybe not the most well-trodden path then to a career in the city of London?
Definitely. I mean, it's not a great sob story in that I had a wonderful childhood, but yeah, my parents were both teachers. My grandparents were either sort of policemen or sort of local workers. So there's nothing special in the background. I had a fortunate thing of decent education in a massive comprehensive school in the middle of mid Wales in Brecon, where catchment area was sort of 40 miles radius. So I lived in the middle in Brecon itself, but I had friends who were 40 miles either way. So the big challenge was, could you pass your driving test as close to 17 as possible, and sort of learning on farm tracks and things before the big day. There was part of the fact both my parents had been to university in London, so there was no sort of closed-minded thing. So that's where they come to uni. But once I got here, there was no thought of ever going back. So I still have some relatives still there, but yeah. And
so what was the initial trigger? I mean, for me, it's something which it happens if you go to school in London, particularly a private school like I went to. It's a very obvious track to, you get to 16 years old and you start getting ushered in a certain direction if it feels like you have Oxbridge potential. What was for you? At what point did you realise, or did you come to think, I want to go and study at the elite establishment?
It's a really interesting question. I was very lucky that I was quite good at maths. And so maths was really easy. I was around, I'm so old that it was the time of privatizations, and I was quite interested in the stock market and started punting very small amounts of money on flotations like BT and various other bits and pieces. And I could tell that I was going to do okay at A-levels. I mean, that's what the school sort of said. But I thought I would like to do economics. And if I was going to do Oxbridge, at Oxford at the time, you could only do PPE. And I hadn't written an essay for a long time, right? So I was a bit stressed by that. So then I thought, well, I'll tell you what, I'll try for Cambridge. I knew nothing. Right? So I said, I'll try for Cambridge. And if I'm any good, I'll switch, because you can do the tripos. So I remember telling my maths teacher that I was not going to go for Oxford. I would like to try for Cambridge, at which point her face, bless her, just sort of fell, because if you're listening to this in Oxford, Cambridge maths is much harder than Oxford maths. So it was a joint effort with her where, bless her, she gave me sort of Saturday mornings, and we'd sit and we'd look at past papers, and sometimes she could do them and sometimes she couldn't. And sometimes I could follow what she was doing. And I very fortunately got in to do maths. But always with this hope that I might switch to economics, because I didn't really want to do theoretical physics, which is kind of where Cambridge maths took me. So I remember going and saying fairly early on in the first year, could I switch to economics? And they said, well, possibly, maybe, but you won't be able to do any of the maths papers. And I said, well, why not? They said, well, they'll be too easy. Yeah.
Yeah, sign me up. Yeah.
So they wouldn't let me. And the maths got more and more and more theoretical. And I was thinking, this is terrible. They were saying basically stay as a statistician and you might sort of eventually turn into an actuary. Great. And then with sort of how these random walks work, I started dating a lawyer. And I'd never thought about law, and actually her subject sounded an awful lot more interesting than mine. So I asked, could I switch to law? And they let me. And I never looked back from that. So I did 2 years, 1 year of maths and 2 years of law, which is not that standard either to do.
Yeah.
But it worked brilliantly because, essentially, there's certainly at uni when I was there were two sorts of maths law questions. One was, Fred is walking along and a brick drops on his head, and the guy who drops the brick was negligent, and you're just doing for me it was like a flow chart, like a mathematical problem, and you could find the answers as it were, as this could be this or this could be that. Or they're questions like, the philosophy of contract law or something. But by the end of the third year, I was doing kind of the essay questions because I'd learned to write by then. So yeah, that was great. And then I decided I better qualify because somebody had to pay for law school. So I managed to get a job at Linklaters. Because
it was interesting. It was something which I Googled. I saw law and maths on your LinkedIn from Cambridge, and I Googled it to even see if that course was.
It's not a course
available nowadays, because
I think you can still fight. So you have to do a part 1 and a part 2 to get a degree, and they can be separate. It's just that most things don't link. So.
And do you think there was a benefit in that in the end? Because I agree with you that conceptually it doesn't feel like the two skill sets naturally marry together.
Lord Denning was a mathematician. So
was he?
Yeah, he was. Yeah, exactly.
But do you think there was in the end it gave you a benefit to have seen?
Massive benefit. I mean, how many lawyers in who sort of blanch when numbers get dropped into contracts, or somebody's explaining some sort of private equity ratchet idea that some genius has had and it's got to be translated. It's so much more comfortable when you can do both sides of that. Not to say that the wordsmithing isn't really important, but if you sort of really run away from the numbers. So, it was hugely important for me. And then, in fact, that was the ticket for me when I decided that law was not me forever. Yeah. It was obviously I am numerate. I can do this, which is how I managed to get into banking.
Yeah. So let's go to that bit. That the law, you decided, having had an exposure to both maths and law, you thought at the end of that, presumably not because of the girl you were dating at the time, but
we were not together after that.
To go into law and training contract, and you went to a Magic Circle firm, so a very particular type of training to be a lawyer as well. How did you make that decision? And then tell me about your experience for the first few years doing that job.
Law was brilliant. I honestly, when genuinely, when I was doing my math subject, it got to the point where I really wasn't interested in sort of nth dimensional vectors. It didn't mean anything to me, and I quite like the real life. So once I switched to law, and I was actually chatting to my mates about them wanting to return their record to our price or whatever it was at the time, it really resonated. Now, obviously, city law is slightly different, but I was fortunate to get the job, and I just really enjoyed deal making. What I didn't like, I discovered after a few years, was people saying, "We'll leave it to the lawyers now." And I go, "Well, what was why did you do this deal? I understand what you want me to document, and I understand what you want me to worry about, but what was the genesis of the actual getting together in a room to agree this deal?" And then I sort of flippantly say this, but the bankers kept talking about the model. And I, kept thinking, I'd quite like to meet her. But it was, and so this financial model and what it did, and it was never shared with so I was sort of thinking that was something I really ought to go and understand.
Yeah.
I also had the rare privilege of getting drafted. I think it was supposed to be an honour. I got put on the rail privatisation team at the law firm. And this was, potentially 7 years of work ahead of me privatising. That was not something that really inspired me. And it's probably going to go full circle now. I'll see all my good franchise agreement work being unpicked by the next government. So I basically decided that I would move after 1 year of qualification before I got too embroiled in and I'd had a wonderful, I got sent to New York and I had just the most wonderful time. And I got a job with a bank called Warburg, which at the time now is UBS, but at the time was a sort of a blue chip M&A corporate finance thing, and persuaded them that I did know something about numbers. But actually the blend with law was really interesting because I could do a lot of blue book work with the city code, which I know is not supposed to be legal, but actually is. And so I sort of snuck my way in, do a lot of takeovers and the offer documents, and so was able to sort of digest hundreds of pages of guff, as well as finally get my teeth into the model and understand the financials. So that was good.
So I think there's an early stage trend of boldness in your career, in the sense that even, popular dictum is that nowadays, more so than the last decade, and then probably even more so than the 2 decades before, it's a lot more acceptable for people to have moved between jobs. I look at CVs all the time in my role as associate recruitment head for private equity, and it's no longer the case that if we see three firms before,
you sort of go, what's going on?
But the time you were making decisions probably which in that era were not so standard, to switch both career type, also discipline type in undergrad, very, very early when you were very young. Do you think there's anything from a upbringing or a personality type perspective which meant that for you had that boldness to go and make those big calls quite early?
I honestly haven't thought about it. I suspect it was probably because I had nothing to lose, in the sense that, if I didn't know what I wanted to do, and therefore that thing over the fence, if I could get into it, let's go and have a look. Now that's tougher today, I think, in today's recruitment market. Yeah. But I have got, I say to my children and anybody who'll listen, I don't think you can ever make a mistake, in the sense that everything you do, if you move forward, you are picking up experiences. And I think the kids today get sort of forced to think that really they should get into a profession. And that's it. And they don't know what the profession involves. And why should they? And then it's like, but if I've made the wrong decision, I'm stuck. And I go, well, that's just simply not true. And I'm going to come on to it, but I made a mistake in my little random walk. And I keep trying to say, you look at where I've ended up. But it wasn't a sort of beautifully thought through path. It was a kind of like, no, I'd like to learn something else. So I'm going to go and see if I can learn it.
And careers are long, you have time to.
So much time. You think about it, I did 3 years in law, which was not that long in a career, but actually I thought I'd learnt a huge amount. Then I did 3 years at Warburg, which was probably about 7 years work in 3, to be honest. But again, you learn a lot. And then there's an opportunity to go and apply it somewhere else. So I thought that I didn't want to be an advisor. That's finally what I concluded, was that I didn't like people leaving me in the room and sort of say, well, you sort it out, I'm going to go off and do something else.
Yeah.
Play golf or something.
You wanted to go and play golf.
I wanted to go and play golf, exactly. And
I get that.
a mate of mine, bless him, had found an advert for private equity, which at the time was so fledged. I really am old. I mean, people didn't know what private equity really was. It was called VC for a start. He went off and had a very successful career in private equity. I, at the time, had just sold Tetley Tea, the tea bags business, to what is now Silverfleet. But they didn't have a job. And so, in fact, I took a job briefly in the corporate finance department of Guinness, the brewing company, PLC, and went into what I can only describe as the civil service. No offence to the civil service, but I mean, it was unbelievable. I was given a grade which dictated the size of my office and the desk. And I was, I think, 7 moves off board director. And I mean, you could see it. And they were doing nothing, because if you think of large corporate, your big strategic moves come along every 15 years or something, and or maybe never. And I was just used to deal after deal after deal after deal. So I fairly rapidly worked out that was an error on my part. I thought it might lead me into line management and sort of doing a real job in business. But they had quite a disparate portfolio of stuff which I went ferreting around. So I got a brewery built in the Caribbean that needed a sort of a whole project plan. So that was a nice couple of weeks of pulling that together. I sold some stuff in South Wales pub chains, and they owned Glen Eagles at the time, so I used to go and help them occasionally on a Friday afternoon. And then I just thought, this is rubbish, I need to quit. So that was the mistake. But, as it was, actually who I met and seeing the inside of a large PLC, I still look back at it and think, I kind of understand what you guys are going through.
Yeah.
And then I saw an advert in the newspaper, back to the age thing, for a French or German speaker for what is now Silverfleet. And I rang them up and said, well, I don't really speak French or German. I have O-level in both. But I did spend about 30 days in a face-to-face negotiation with you, selling you Tetley Tea, any chance of a job. And eventually I got a job with them. And I've been there 27 years now.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So what was the rationale for needing French and German? That was the investment.
Well, Silverfleet was very, very early to go pan-European. And they were trying to open French and German offices. And I think they thought originally, why don't we hire in a speaker to live in London, work in London, and then we'll use them to seed a French or a German office as our sort of first foray. And I find it quite interesting because you can see a lot of the mid-market houses now in the UK that have done very well now doing what we frankly did 30 years ago. And it'll be a really interesting journey for them because obviously those local markets are also much more mature. So
then you're in private equity, and the brand you joined at the time
was called Credential Venture Managers.
Yeah. And then did it go through a couple of iterations?
It did. So, well, it basically, it was the captive private equity arm of Credential, the big insurance company. And we were investing largely life fund money. So, the man on the street saving with the Pru, a little bit of it would come to us. But we also had a few other pension funds that they were with basically a very short form contract, and we were just managing their money. This was way before fund structures were kind of invented. And we were doing deals in the UK and then a little bit more in Europe. And then actually in 1997, the Pru wanted a license in China to sell insurance. And so we, with their encouragement, started up in Asia, and we opened a Hong Kong office and ultimately ended up with an office in Hong Kong, Singapore, Tokyo, Seoul, and in Australia. And so we never had a US office. The Pru in the US had its own little structure, but we had offices in Europe and offices in Asia, and we did a load of deals in Asia. So there was a lot of international deals, which was great. We eventually changed our name to PPM Managers or PPM Capital because the ventures bit became irrelevant as people realized that venture should be consigned where it is, and private equity became the new norm.
Yep.
And then in 2007, we finally agreed that we ought to buy ourselves out from the Pru, which a lot of other people had done probably about 10 years earlier. And we renamed ourselves Silverfleet then because we had to come up with a new name.
And how was that process for the buyout? Was it
It was the worst buyout we've ever done, in the sense, the most painful buyout. Trying to deal with a large corporate, all sorts of stupid things conspired to make it hyper difficult. Not least, sort of technical, boring break, but we were in the Credential staff pension scheme. And it was one of the longest running pension schemes of all time. I mean, it was sort of set up in 1880 or something. And as I understand it, in order to do a buyout from that pension, you have to value the entire scheme. So it wasn't just our little bit that got valued. The entire thing had to be valued. And there are only two people who do things of that scale, one of which is the Pru, and the other was their big rival, Legal & General. And so it caused all sorts of consternation about, well, could we share data, and how do we, in the end, we sort of struck a deal. But it was, it caused all sorts of anxiety. It was the first thing they pretty much spun out from it.
Was there mixed emotions from the Pru at the point at which you're going independent from them? Or?
No, mixed emotions. No, not really. I mean, we had become a bit of a pain for them because we own mostly majority positions. Our portfolio needed to be consolidated into their reporting. And as they got bigger in the US, and the US was requiring more and more controls over all subsidiaries, they suddenly realized that we had more negative controls rather than positive controls over our portfolio. And therefore there was this sort of tension. So they were quite glad to get rid of us in some ways. And we had become too dependent on them. Ultimately, it's great not to have to go and raise money externally.
Yeah.
It's a very, very luxurious position to be in. But if they ever had a change of heart, we were stuffed. And, ultimately, we'll come on to it, I'm sure, but part of the coming late to the fundraising party meant that we were forever on the outside of track record with LPs.
Yeah. So then you go and do your first independent fundraise.
Correct. Simultaneous with the buyout.
Right. The buyout 2007, I think first fund was raised 2009. Is that right?
Well, 2007, there's a history here of our timing being terrible in some ways. So 2008, massive financial crisis.
Yeah.
So we did have a first close in 2007, but then actually couldn't do anything through most of 2008. So first investment started in about 2009. Second fund, 2015, much more straightforward. But if you just do the maths, right, that's 8 years later. So we had a very extended first fund. And by the time we raised the second fund, most of the first investors who had been, a ragbag, frankly, of people, banks who wanted to get into private equity and whatever, they'd mostly churned. So it was almost like a second coming in terms of a new bunch of LPs in 2015.
Yeah. And is it the period between fund one and fund two, that obviously by today's standards, that feels like a long gap, but was that the same then as well? Yeah,
it was. We were, I think if there's one of the great strengths of Silverfleet has been that we've forever focused on making capital gains for our clients and getting to carry. If I'm really honest, the whole fund management logic of invest fast, get out there again, raise another fund, that took a long time for us to kind of realize that is part of the game. That's a learning. If you look back, whatever it is, 15, 20 years.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And so your personal role in the fund one and fund two of the group that was involved in fundraising there, where does your seniority rank in the group?
Well, I ran London through all that time, so sort of the biggest team. But we had offices. But when we bought ourselves out, we decided that there was a limit to what we could raise a fund for. So we decided that we would exit all our Asian operations, which had been very successful, but that really didn't sort of fit with what we were going to do. Concentrate on mid-market European, and we had a French and a German office at the time. And then over time, we developed, a small outlet in Scandinavia and in Holland. And so, yes, I ran the UK team for a long, long period of time, and then took over in whatever it was, 2019, as managing partner.
And so any specific deals which stand out to you as particularly successful or impactful on your career and that you look really fondly back on?
I've loved almost all my deals. I hate losing money and I love exits that are successful. I think my greatest fun has been doing international deals. So I then also ran the Nordics for a long time. And, if you're going to rock up in the Nordics and say, hi guys, we're Silverfleet, and I know you've got EQT and Nordic and all this, but you don't want to touch them. You want to touch. It was all about finding businesses that were wanting to do international expansion. So that was what we used to sell, was that we've just done this and we can do it in the States, we can do it in Asia. And I had a couple of really lovely deals, either in Sweden or in Denmark, where we did exactly that, where we were able to elevate a business that had been either owned by a very domestic Nordic fund or indeed been owned by a corporate, and say, independently, we can now take you outside. I had a wonderful one in Sweden, which did allergy testing. It was the world's largest allergy tester. We ended up calling it Fardia and sold it to Cinven in due course. And it just had operations all over the place, but in a very, very niche thing of allergy, which over time got more and more important because, seemingly we're all getting more allergic to things. It didn't cure anything. It literally just told you exactly what it was that you were allergic to, with a blood test rather than, in the UK, we tend to still stick people in the arm, but most of the world takes a small amount of blood and puts it into a lab. And that's what they did. It was brilliant.
And then, so you referred to before, so 2019, you become managing partner. So you're the fourth managing partner I've had on these episodes, but the other three they were either all part of the founding group, so were managing partner effectively de facto, or they lateraled in as managing partner. So you're the first who did an internal ascent. Yeah. So I'm quite interested in that in terms of what do you think are the key skill sets that are required in order to navigate an internal route up to become a managing partner?
Yes, survival. I mean, in the sense that people come and go, it always surprises me through the years that people who you thought were going to be there forever. And there was always that thing, when you're a senior associate or whatever, you look up and you think, they're just going to be here forever, and never go. And actually people reach a natural limit, or they don't have the energy or whatever, and they sort of move on. So there is just a sort of a degree of attrition as people kind of get older. I was very fortunate. You're right. I inherited something, in some ways good and bad. I inherited a very long track record and a culture. And I was very fortunate in that as head of the UK, I realised I'd actually recruited virtually everybody into the team over many, many, many years. And I was always involved in the recruitment. So even the overseas guys, I was involved in their recruitment as well. And so when Neil indicated he wanted to go, there frankly wasn't anybody else who wanted it. So it wasn't like I had to sort of have some internecine warfare to win the top. That was good. We probably will perhaps come on to the Real Deals article about the demise of Silverfleet, as they call it, or what went wrong. Yeah. The succession, we could always have done it earlier, but it was a very smooth succession. I mean, I knew all the LPs. I'd been on all the fundraising trips for many years, so it wasn't like some sort of seismic shock. The thing that did for us was COVID, and that's at the end of the day what happened. But the fact that I was able to come into the top spot, knowing everybody and knowing everything was great. It took not that long, but I did have views on what we probably needed to do to sharpen up for the next 10 years.
Yep.
And that's a really interesting moment in time where, you've got to sit down with your partner group and say, I think we need to have a vision about something new. And, maybe you should be able to do that without a change at the top, but it is quite hard. People slip into sort of comfort, I guess.
Yeah. So but is it fair to say you wanted that, you wanted that step up? It wasn't.
Yeah. It wasn't a sort of a default position. No, I was happy to take it on.
And so what was the something new?
Well, I mean, people get at the end of the day, I was talking about sort of being a fundraising or we're a product at the end of the day. And, you have to sort of be blunt about the fact that just because you're successfully able to identify deals and make money and, management teams want to work with you, actually explaining what you're doing different to all the other firms out there when you go and see a new LP, that is a skill in itself. Now, that's the sort of curse of being around for 40 years, is that people think they know you and they don't think you're able to change and they may not need you because they've got what they think is a looky-likey in their portfolio. And it is quite difficult to sort of go in and say, look, I know my track record's over here, but actually we're going to be really good over here because that's that's what you might give me money for. To give you an example, we had a very, very long successful track record in retail investing. We were known for it. I mean, it was one of the sectors I ran for a long time. We made a lot of money in retail, but in, I don't know, the sort of mid-20s, I said, I don't think we can make any money in retail anymore. I just don't understand e-com, how, we're ever going to compete in terms of doing that. So we started moving more into leisure. But to basically say we can do this, or we could sort of, for example, take that retail experience and move it into over here, whatever over here is, you've got to take people with you on that journey. So that's the slight sort of curse of a long track record. But one of the things people used to say was, well, we can't do software investment. And so, well, why not? There's nothing clever about software investing. I mean, you just need to understand exactly where you sit with all the criteria we've always applied. And over a period of years, we showed that we not only had a little bit of software experience in the portfolio, just sort of we picked up through the years, but actually we could specifically target software deals and make a success of them. And we did. And so, people sort of doubt that you can move the needle, and you can. You just need to invest a bit of time and effort.
And so you referred to the article. I'm not actually so focused on the article itself, but I think it draws out some interesting themes which would be good to get your input on. So obviously you get to 2019. You begin a third fundraise, is that right?
Yeah.
And there's a few factors that the article cites as being particular challenges which ultimately led to wind down. One of them is obviously COVID, which we can talk about, but the other one was about going to market or going to LPs too early.
Yeah, I do honestly. Like all these, never believe what you read in the press. I think that's completely misplaced in terms of, you just do the maths. We raised 2015. The plan was to have a first close for Fund 3 in 2020.
Yep.
Remember the date. And people saying, well, you went before you had an exit. Well, guess what? We did have a plan to have exits, and we were in the second round on our first exit in February 2020, and had to pull it because COVID shut down, the market. So I don't think we went too early at all. We were in need of raising money, and we were pretty closely deployed, and it just was one of those things where the COVID timing was dreadful. They also mentioned succession, which I think I've touched on. I don't think that was a shock to anybody, that we were going through succession. I knew all the LPs. I'd met all the prospective LPs. Now, I don't want to bang on about COVID, but there is. It's clearly unfortunate, and if you can ask me about sort of the worst bit of my career, in some ways, it's a shame that I had to call time on a firm that's been around a long old period of time.
Yeah.
But it was the right decision. I don't blame the LPs at all. They were essentially, when you go out and you say, I want to raise a fund, and it's meltdown in COVID, they're also like, they don't ask me for money yet. I don't know what's going on. And as that goes through, and when we get into 2021, when I've already had an extension, and I'm saying, well, new year, what do you think? They say, look, essentially, we've been told to reduce our roster of GPs. Perfectly logical conclusion in troubled times. And we were pretty much first-time investment for almost all our LPs. They didn't have a track record with us because they'd come in 2015 for the first time. So in that sense, it just was one of those things. And what I concluded was that we could, at that stage, do the right thing by our investees by selling off in an orderly fashion. And if we did it right, all my colleagues could get out into the market and get new jobs, rather than it be some sort of disaster. Yeah. I'm pleased to say they have all gone off and got good jobs. And there's always these things now. Essentially, people say it's a failure. And I guess it's a little bit of failure in it, but we're a very male-orientated industry, and everybody wants to measure the size of their fund. So bigger and better. And you think, well, actually, wasn't the right thing for us.
And there's also, I'm very keen to focus on the human element of it as well, because a lot of this podcast is about understanding the people behind. Yeah. So your feelings, your state of mind in that period, how would you characterize? I mean, it's an extremely tough thing to have to go through, and decisions which you probably, when taking the role, 2019 is not something you'd have expected to have to do. So how?
It never crossed my mind when I took it over. No, I mean, so I pretty much recruited everybody into the firm. So to over time tell all of them, look, this hasn't worked out as we expected. Maybe we go back to what I said at the start. Actually these things, if you move forward, you'll all be fine. So I sort of thinking about it and thought about it in that way maybe. But, for many of them, it was a shock. They really wanted to be at Silverfleet for, another 20 years maybe. And we were really good at having very long-standing people, which we grew and made partners and grew and made partners for a long time. And nobody wants to be forced into a job change. So there were two things that were really important for me. One was that we were completely open and honest about what needed to happen. Two, to treat people fairly and give them, vested carry and sort of just make it easy. And the encouragement, you'll be okay. And genuinely, they've all gone on to, the great diaspora of Silverfleet people means that they've ended up in some great places. So, I'm sure there are some people go, I wish it hadn't happened. Yeah. So what? Actually life moves on.
And did you have to make a decision between pulling the plug entirely and pulling the plug on the fundraise, but then coming back to it a year down the line? Or is that
so this was the big debate, was could we sort of incubate somehow? But again, we had unusually for a mid-market firm, I had 60 people in 5 offices.
Yeah.
It's quite hard to incubate that cost base for a long period of time if you genuinely don't think you're going to come back out fairly quickly. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, I think we've done exactly what we said we were going to do, which is we've realised the vast majority of the portfolio very successfully. And I suspect, again, it's all fantasy fundraise, but, if we went back out now in 2022, 23, we perhaps could have done it. But at the time, all the team had gone. So, it's sort of self-fulfilling at some point.
Yeah. And is there anything about the implementation? One of the things that really surprised me on episode 3 with Fabrice Nortan is I asked him whether if he was to do what he'd just done again, which was to start a new fund.
Yeah.
And he
said, didn't he, that he had lots to learn.
Yeah. I mean, he'd do a lot differently, which actually surprised me. I didn't think he'd say that. But if you were to think about the implementation of the wind down and you were asked to do it again, obviously not something necessarily you'd been prepared for before. Is there anything you would change on that? Or do you think you did it the best you could have?
I think genuinely, everything in my entire career at the end of the day led to sitting in my little study at home with 13 portfolio companies in Feb 2020. All melting down across, multiple geographies, multiple sectors, and battling that through for 18 months, 2 years to where we got to in terms of being able to realize, that was a really tough period. Making the decision in mid 21 that this just was not going to come fast enough and therefore I have to wind it down. My biggest fear was either I was going to end up with an enormous portfolio and no team, or no portfolio and an enormous team. And actually we managed to bring it sort of systematically down together. Yeah. And I hope everybody is sort of satisfied with where we'll end up. I think if I had anything to do again, it's probably about the story. People fill in the gaps of there must be a problem because Silverfleet hasn't raised, and how could a 40-year-old fund 40-year-old firm not go again? And I just assume, well, it's nothing to do with you lot, the market. We just got to concentrate on what we're doing. But it sort of, if there's any opportunity to go back and say, actually, it's been a cracking success. I mean, I say to people who say to me, are you not sad that it didn't happen? I said, well, don't feel sorry for me. At the end of the day, we will nail this fund. It's going to be a great success. Just not, the timing wasn't enough to make it a success for the next 10 years.
Yeah. So what you're saying really is that you should have done Life of a Dealmaker quicker.
Correct. This is my chance to get my story out.
Yeah. A bit late. Well, I think it's a good time to bring in the rollover question. It might be that you feel we've already discussed it, but the question from Fabrice was, what has been the most defining moment of your private equity career?
Yeah, I suspect I have answered it I think I will go down in history as pulling the plug on Silverfleet, and that's probably the most defining moment. But the bit I'm most proud of is that fact that if I look back now, the thought that we had this extraordinary shutdown across multiple facets, to be able to deal with that, it's a hell of an achievement. It really is. I mean, not least, for example, on Riviera that you and I worked on, a fantastic travel business in the UK, 200 million plus of turnover, going to zero for 2 years.
Yeah.
On government edict. It's nothing to do with us. But, actually, we've got to keep the brand, keep the staff, keep the customers happy. And I'm pleased to say, 4 years on, it's going to be a cracking deal. We still own it. We still, and it's back with a bang. But I mean, that's a heck of an achievement. We're not alone at all. But I'm really proud of that.
And so that's proudest, and then flipping it onto career highlight. What would you look back on as being the pinnacle?
I think building the team that actually, when I could, even when I had to sit with them all and say, look, this is the conclusion, that they knew that it was the right thing to do, even though they didn't want it.
Yeah.
And still being, them knowing that they had great training, great camaraderie. We really had a lot of fun together.
And so we talk about realizations. How do you see the M&A market? I think the Bain & Company Private Equity Outlook report just came out, and there was a phrase in there where they said that it's safe to say that it's never been harder to sell a portfolio company.
It's really, really interesting. I think I'm perhaps more pessimistic than some generally. I'll be a little bit more realistic perhaps about some of the spin I say. I think there's every chance that the back end of this year we'll start to see it pick up quite strongly. I think we just need to see interest rates fall properly rather than just be talked about. I've just sold the business. It's not announced yet, but we signed something last week. So it is doable. It's going to be a great return for us. I love selling things, but you do have to work super hard at finding the right moment and the right price. And it's not, as you know, it's just not sort of falling off a log kind of thing. It is tough at the moment, I'm sure, just in terms of financing and sentiment and everything else. But I genuinely feel that the next 6 months we'll see real green shoots.
So before we go into your rollover question, the one other thing I did want to ask you about was you're a trustee of a charity.
I am, yeah.
I wanted to just hear about that and your motivation for taking that role and how you're finding it.
I'm the chair of a multi-academy trust, as they call it, which is a sort of multi-school group in North London. Both my parents, like I said, were teachers. I've always sort of valued education and think it is a way of getting people like me out of the middle of Wales. And setting them on the right path or giving them opportunities. So I finally wanted to have some time to give something back. It's everything I kind of hoped, in that I wanted to see whether 20 plus years of private equity actually had any transferable skills. And they're all transferable, frankly. I mean, the governance of anything is very similar to you're sort of sitting on the board of a private equity company.
Yeah,
obviously, perhaps with a slightly more diffuse set of targets rather than just make money. But it's been fascinating, quite hands-on, obviously different, dealing with lots and lots of lovely people who have all sorts of good motivations, and you have to encourage them and cajole them and push them maybe in places they don't want to go. But no, it's been really good, actually. So I'm really pleased I'm doing it.
And what's the next chapter once Silverfleet is wound up? What does the next phase look like?
It's a very good question. I don't want to stop. I'm not going to raise another fund. I want to use 26, 27 years of experience to help in some sort of private equity capacity. So whether that's as a non-exec on founder-owned boards or other, private capital-owned boards where they want to have somebody of my age and experience, get them help get them ready for exit, or people who've got a portfolio who need somebody to sort of give a perspective at the portfolio level. Those are the things that sort of fascinate me.
Well, you've got the beard for a Ned.
Exactly, I can sort of sit there like this.
You haven't stroked it much during this conversation.
It's terrible. Yeah.
And that's probably something to work on for when you.
Oh, so I write my question,
please, and then.
Do you have a pen?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so I put it in here. Is this the same envelope for all episodes?
That's why it's a bit battered up.
It
Yeah,
should be golden.
I think our budget can probably stretch to a new one. Maybe I'll look into that. Gareth, thank you very much for your time.
Pleasure. Thanks, Dan.